We'll get started really, really shortly. There's still a few more people coming in. What I wanted to say before we start the presentation proper was today, the reason I'm running this webinar is because all of my speaking engagements have been cancelled for the next few weeks, as I'm sure yours have as well. And today I would have been in Adelaide, which is the capital of South Australia, a state in Australia. And I would have been speaking to a large number of parents who were coming along for a bit of afternoon tea. And I was going to be talking to them about dyslexia and dysgraphia. And I can't now. So I've decided just to run the presentation as a webinar for free. And one day I hope that I will be able to meet up again with all of those lovely parents. So I'm sorry that it never went ahead, but it's only postponed. We will meet again. Also, you should know that this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of this webinar will be available on my website. My website is lifelongliteracy.com. You probably already know that because you registered via my website. All right, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen with you because that's where the presentation is. So I'm hoping that you get a good view of the screen now and hoping that you can see the PowerPoint presentation that's coming up. If you can't, there's not a whole lot I can do to help you right now, but it will be well rendered on the recording. So fingers crossed you're all there and able to see it. All right, let's begin. This is Dyslexia Dysgraphia for parents, but I know there's quite a few practitioners here as well and people just interested in the field. You are all completely welcome. As by way of introduction to me, I'm a linguist in private practice, and a large percentage of the students that come to see me are dyslexic. I run a practice here where I have several tutors that work with children who are struggling with reading and writing, and a lot of them do have a dyslexia diagnosis. Some have a dysgraphia diagnosis too, but that's a little bit less prevalent. The diagnosis is less prevalent than the dyslexia diagnosis, but we do have officially dysgraphic students as well as ones that we suspect are dysgraphic. And in yesterday's webinar about the assessment and screening tools that we use, I talked a little bit about what makes me suspect dysgraphia. So have a look at that if you want to look into it a little bit further. At the end of this presentation, we're going to have question time. So I'm going to be answering questions. I think I've asked enough questions, but I'm going to be answering questions. There are some things that I need to remind you of. I can answer questions about either condition. I can talk about dyslexia and dysgraphia, but what I can't do is I can't give you answers about specific cases. Here's why. If you have, and I know lots of you are parents, and I'm sure you have questions about your child, and it's a good idea to try and get those questions answered, but here's how I can't answer them maybe in the way that you want. I just want you to think about it. Case history is really, really important. So I would have to look into family history, if there's any dyslexia or dysgraphia in the family. It's really important for me to know that. I need to know if there has been a diagnosis or any suspected diagnosis. I need to know if what kind of teaching the child has had. This is really important for me. I need to know what input they're preloaded with. The answer to those questions would take me quite a long time. It would take me more time than we have. So what I don't want to do is give you the wrong information. So if I don't have case history, family history, diagnosis, the kind of input that they've already had, I can't answer that question. I might give you the wrong information, and I absolutely don't want to do that. So I can't answer specific questions about your child, but I can answer questions about the conditions of dyslexia and dysgraphia. I hope you don't mind. If you do have specific questions and you want more answers about your child specifically, a really, really good starting point is the International Dyslexia Association. They will then be able to inform you about local dyslexia groups. There's a lot of really good evidence-based dyslexia groups on Facebook as well, but start with the IDA, start with the International Dyslexia Association, and for dysgraphia, that's a good starting point too. And from that, they have lists of recommended groups that you can then go to should you want more answers about your specific case. Speaking of specific cases though, here's a scenario. This is what I see a lot. I get parents who say to me, I think there's something not right here, or who have had that thought for a long time. I think there's something not right. When their child is starting to develop their literacy, they often think something's not working here. This is what I never see. This is what I never see. I've never had a parent come to me with the thought that there's something not right, and then later on go, no, I was imagining it. Because, and the reason I say that is because there is quite a culture sometimes at some schools of wait and see. There's a culture of maybe it's just going to click. There's a culture of, oh, look, they're emotionally immature. When they grow up a bit, they're going to be fine with reading and writing. And I don't accept that culture. If you think that your child is falling behind, if you have an inkling that they're falling behind, you pretty much need to follow that up, because it doesn't just click. Reading and writing is hard, and it needs specific sequential teaching in a lot of cases. So that's the first thing. That's the bit that I wanted to say right at the beginning with dyslexia and dysgraphia, with literacy. Secondly, to use or not to use the terms dyslexia and dysgraphia. I know that there is a debate about that, and I'm really interested in that debate. I think it's a useful debate. Problems arise, and this is why it's a useful debate, if we refer to every struggling reader as dyslexic, if we refer to every struggling writer as dysgraphic. That's a problem. These difficulties are only a possible sign of dyslexia and dysgraphia. You can make both those conditions better by having high quality early literacy instruction. And that's why I like to talk to parents about advocacy as well. High quality early literacy instruction at school will help to get a better deal for all children, but especially dyslexic and dysgraphic children. So the low progress is a sign, and therefore that helps us to then refer to professionals who can make a diagnosis. The other reason that I like to use the word dyslexia is that it's not isolated to reading. Dyslexia affects the ability to do other things as well, like spell and write and pronounce words. The word dyslexia is also searchable, and it's identifiable, and it's succinct. So it's not, you can talk about specific learning disorders and disorder of this and disorder of that. Dyslexia is a slightly nicer term, and it's one word, and it's searchable. It has a name as well. So children who experience dyslexia often have negative self-talk about being lazy or dumb, or even have others tell them that that's what they are when they find out that they have dyslexia. It's often a sense of relief, and the word dyslexia just has much less negative connotations than lazy or dumb. And there's a growing advocacy movement. The picture on the right-hand side here is Code Red Dyslexia Network, which is an example of a bunch of movers and shakers in Australia who are changing things at the legislative level, or who are raising awareness at the legislative level for children with dyslexia to try and get a better deal for those. This presentation is weighted towards dyslexia. We know more about that condition. So I hope if you've come for dysgraphia that you bear with us, because we are going to talk about that as well. The warning signs for dyslexia. This is where you start to think, could it be this? And do I need a referral to a professional who can diagnose this? Warning signs are persistent. This is the thing, persistent difficulty. So again, as a parent, you know what's persistent and what's fleeting with your child. Also, a professional will be more inclined to make a dyslexia or a dysgraphia diagnosis if they've had 6 months of intervention. Now, in regard to dyslexia, here are some of the characteristics. With dyslexia, it's inaccurate and slow reading, difficulty with decoding. So if they come to a word they haven't seen before, they can't figure it out. Difficulty with comprehension of a text. If you have difficulty getting words off the page, it's going to be hard for you to comprehend what you're reading, obviously. Difficulty with spelling, and that spills over to dysgraphia as well. Difficulties with grammar, punctuation, and other writing skills can be dyslexia or dysgraphia, and we'll look at the difference between those shortly. There are other factors that contribute to low progress in reading and writing, and so we have to rule these out, and that's again what a qualified professional can do. So once you've looked at those warning signs and the child has had intervention, and by the way, it should be high quality intervention. There's lots of low quality intervention as well. But again, the International Dyslexia Association is a good starting point for figuring out what is high quality and what is low quality. But other factors also need to be ruled out. And this is why a case history is really important. These difficulties that children are having with reading and writing could be because they have intellectual impairments. So low IQ can also contribute to reading and to low progress in reading and writing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're dyslexic. Also, hearing. Every child that comes to see us, the first question I ask is, have they had their hearing checked? Because we need to know if the sounds are even going in, because it all starts with sound. Reading and writing all starts with sound. So I ask, how's their hearing? Have you had audiometry? I don't mean specialized hearing Tomatis method type assessments. I just mean plain audiometry. Can they hear or not? We'll come a little bit to those other assessments that are not recommended for hearing. Just can they hear or can they not hear? Do they have a history of hearing impairment? That can contribute to low progress in reading and writing. Doesn't necessarily mean it's dyslexia. Also, vision. Can they see? Can they see the page? Again, just plain optometry, not behavioral optometry, just plain optometry. Are they long-sighted, short-sighted? Do they have astigmatism? That sort of thing can be found at your local optometrist, not behavioral optometrist. And we'll come to that a little bit later too. Vision can impair reading and writing. So if we get that checked, we're going to have so we're going to be able to rule out whether or not it's actually that rather than dyslexia and dysgraphia. Also, mental health issues, children who are undergoing trauma or have mental health issues like depression and anxiety and so on can sometimes fall behind in reading and writing too, as they deal with the things in their lives. That's not dyslexia either. So these things those factors need to be considered before making a diagnosis. The other thing is inadequate instruction. There definitely is, and this is why we exist as advocacy groups, there are definite scales of effectiveness of instruction for children. And what we find is that any initial teaching that is random rather than sequential and explicit and has a scope and sequence will affect the reading and writing progress of not just dyslexic and dysgraphic children, but children who don't have those conditions. As there's a great quote about systematic or code-based phonics, saying that it is the initial early instruction that is code-based, that is phoneme-based, is harmful for none and critical for some. So if the instruction in the school is whole language or balanced literacy, sometimes children can look like they're dyslexic or dysgraphic, but it's just inadequate instruction. And that's where we've also got to take that history. What are they being taught? What input have they had? Is it dyslexia, or is it, as someone coined, dysthesia? You've got to look into that. Going with dyslexia, though, again, we're going to do a little bit of work on that right now. And I'd like to look at some myths and some facts about dyslexia so that you're armed with more information, especially as a parent. A lot of the time, if you suspect dyslexia, I get lots of reports of parents being told it's not that because, and then there's some sort of inadequate understanding of dyslexia. So we're going to look at some myths and facts. I'm not a brain researcher, so I don't really show a lot of pictures about the brain. If you're into looking at the dyslexic brain, there are lots of great resources out there. Marianne Wolf's work is particularly good. Stanislas Dehaene, I'll put links to all of those at the end as well, if you're looking for brain research on it. But what we do know, and what I can talk about, is that it's neurological. It's not the eyes. Dyslexia has got nothing to do with the eyes. It's got nothing to do with the ears. It's got nothing to do with the reflexes, and it's got nothing to do with the digestive system. It's neurological, meaning that the structure of the brain or the brain structures that are usually put together to get somebody reading and writing are not optimum. So brains are basically very, very similar, but some are geared up or just, have that architecture that makes reading and writing really easy. And then on the other end of the scale, they have that architecture that doesn't. So it's neurological. There are some claims that are made about dyslexia that it's to do with excessive screen time. Not true. Excessive screen time isn't great. Excessive anything isn't great, but it doesn't cause dyslexia. Poor diet, not true. Every child should have a good diet, but it doesn't cause dyslexia. Low IQ, that's not true either. That's not a dyslexic condition. You can have a high IQ, you can have an average IQ, you can have a below average IQ and be dyslexic or not be dyslexic. It's not an IQ thing. Some people have even claimed that phonics is a problem, that causes dyslexia, which is just crazy. But I've seen those claims. So I think you should be armed with that understanding that's some of the thinking that's out there. And not being read to as an infant. This is one that I get a lot. So I get a lot of parents who come to see me and they've either had a dyslexia diagnosis or they suspect it. And the first thing that they're met with when they talk about it to the school is that the school teacher says, well, didn't you read to them? That's a horrible myth. That's an absolute crock. There is just no connection between being read to an infant and dyslexia. Being read to as an infant is great. It's a really, really good thing. And nobody is saying that it doesn't affect oral language, which then does contribute to reading progress and reading acquisition, but it's not a cause of dyslexia. Children who have not been read to can acquire literacy just as easily as children who have been read to if they're not dyslexic. It's nothing to do with being read to as an infant. So don't take the guilt trip. It's also not a problem with the eyes. So if you are, I can't stress this strongly enough, if you are looking into a dyslexia diagnosis or you have a dyslexia diagnosis for your child and it's being recommended that they do something with their eyes, like special glasses or colored overlays or funny fonts and all that sort of thing, run. It's got nothing to do with the eyes at all. The people that are telling you that don't know what they're talking about. But we'll look at that a little bit closer soon. Next myth. Dyslexia is developmental. What it means is that it's chronic. It starts in childhood and it affects one or more of the major life functions. It's chronic. It's not something that's just going to go away. And again, I hear a lot of myths where people say things like, oh yeah, I used to be dyslexic, or my child was dyslexic once, or I was cured of my dyslexia. It doesn't just go away. It's chronic. It starts in childhood and it affects one or more of your major life functions, and that is translating print into speech and speech into print. It's not going to be outgrown. So again, the culture of wait and see is not a good culture. Trust your instincts. Don't wait and see. Rule everything out, and start working, or start getting people to work with your child in an intervention setting as soon as possible. It's a developmental disorder, so that doesn't mean it's a disease that can be cured. So any remedies that are out there that will cure dyslexia are not your friend, they're your enemy. Its effects can be lessened, though. You can make it better through high quality intervention. And again, the International Dyslexia Association will give you some really good ideas about what is high quality intervention. Lots of low quality intervention out there. It's a minefield. So start with the IDA. More myths and facts. Dyslexia is pervasive. No matter how you slice up the population, you're going to get a similar distribution of dyslexia. No demographic is more prone. And there are people out there who say that low progress in reading and writing is socioeconomic. If we just fixed poverty, everything else would fall into place. Not true. Not true for dyslexia, especially. Some people get better support because they are in a higher demographic, but that wasn't always the case. Have a read of this quote and see if you can tell me who you think that might have been while I have a drink. We've got some votes for Branson here. Here comes the big reveal. Yes, it was Richard Branson. Now he was in a pretty posh family. He went to a posh boarding school, and back when he was a kid, there wasn't any recognition, very little recognition of dyslexia, and he was punished for not being able to keep up and fit in with the classroom work. So it is pervasive. It affects everyone. All right, next myth. Here we go. Dyslexia is treatable in that you can make it better. You can get a better deal for children with dyslexia. Early reading instruction has to contain systematic synthetic phonics. Very, very briefly, because this is the subject of a whole other webinar, but systematic synthetic phonics means a phonics program from the beginning of school that helps children to associate sounds and letters, and that it has a sequence, an actual sequence, not a random, this is the letter of the week, we're going to look in lots of books to see if we can find it, but an actual sequence and a scope. This is our beginning and this is our end, and we are going to make sure that everybody's keeping up and knows that there are no gaps, or knows everything that they need to know without gaps. That's systematic phonics. And synthetic phonics means that children are taught to blend and segment sounds in words and apply those to letters to get them on the page and off the page. That's systematic synthetic phonics. That is a really, really good idea for dyslexic children. Makes it much easier for them, gives them a better deal. The other thing that is early screening and diagnosis. The earlier you go in, the earlier you intervene, the better you make it for children up the track. Again, that wait and see culture is so damaging to children. The earlier you get in, the better. Don't wait. Reasonable classroom accommodations also can make a huge difference in primary and in high school, and we'll look at some of those accommodations towards the end. This also does apply for dysgraphia. This applies to dysgraphia too. All right, more myths. This is a quote from an author called Mem Fox. She's an Australian author, and she's a very popular children's author. She writes lots of cute books about wombats and so on. And this is what she says, and she stands by this. This hasn't been withdrawn yet. The socially acceptable label of dyslexia. Now, Mem is very, very vocal about the the fact that she thinks that children should just catch reading. Reading is caught, not taught. If you read enough lovely stories, by the way, she's an author of lovely stories. If you read enough lovely stories to children, they're just going to read, because I think she had a child that could just do that. Some of us do have children like that, but we can't make the playing field bumpy for all the rest just because one kid succeeded without much explicit instruction. Dyslexia exists. It is not a socially acceptable, trendy label to mask a poor work ethic. That's a horrible thought. It needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be diagnosed, and people suffering from it need to be assisted. Faddish remedies, however, and cures are more costly than expert intervention. So that's the other thing. It exists and treatment exists. Yes, it makes my blood boil too. And it makes my blood boil because I have a dyslexic daughter. My 16-year-old, Sasha, has dyslexia. And in one of my books, I can't even remember which one, I tell her story. I think it's Language for Life. About her realizing that she was dyslexic, and some of the things that we did together to try and get her a better deal. Dyslexia is not a gift. This is what Sasha says about dyslexia. So she has lots of strengths. I'm not going to list them all here. She's a good girl, lots of strengths, but her strengths are hers, and she's known that all along. Her strengths are her own strengths. They're not a result of dyslexia. Nobody would deliberately choose dyslexia or dysgraphia. Nobody would deliberately choose it, because when you are dyslexic at school, and we still haven't raised consciousness enough to get dyslexics a good deal, humiliation, frustration, misunderstanding, and struggle is part of your life. It's part of your life. Now, a really good question has come up on chat about whether dyslexia is genetic. And may I, Belinda, answer that at the end. If you do have questions, definitely type them up so that you don't forget them. But at the end, I'll return to that if you don't mind. All right, so back to dyslexia being a gift. It is not a gift. Humiliation, frustration, misunderstanding, and struggle is part of your life. If you're dyslexic, and you wouldn't choose that deliberately unless you're some kind of masochist. There's a lot of myths that say dyslexics are out-of-the-box thinkers, and they're more creative, and they're good at design. There is no evidence for this whatsoever. Definitely, if you have a dyslexic child and they are those things, awesome. That's great. But it's not because they're dyslexic. It's because they're that. It's because they already were out-of-the-box thinkers and good at design and creative people. It's not because of dyslexia. It's like saying, my child has red hair and freckles, that must be dyslexia. That's her dyslexia. Not at all. The two are separate. They're separate things. It puts dangerous expectations on people who are not those things, who don't think out of the box or who are more creative. Puts dangerous expectations on those people. And they're already suffering because they're finding it difficult to read and write. So if we talk about it as a gift and they didn't get the gift and they got the bad side of everything, think about how they feel. So it's better to frame it this way. You might need to learn to work quite hard to learn to read and write fast, but it's not impossible, and we're going to give you all the help you need. That's what I like to say to dyslexic children. I also like to say, you've got lots of whatever their strengths are. And if you were at the webinar yesterday about assessment, one of the areas, I produce a document when I assess children. One of the areas I never miss out is strengths. They all have strengths. So luckily you have whatever strength they have to help you out with that. That's a much better way to frame it. There's another question. Do dyslexics require special education? And I see a lot, I go on lots of different Facebook pages and websites and chat rooms and so on to talk about this. And I see practitioners sometimes say, or teachers say, this child is dyslexic, do they require a special type of education? And the answer is no, they don't. They don't require special, different education. They don't require you to do something completely different in the classroom as a teacher. What they require is the same as everybody else. If you look at the components of literacy, there are 5, it's called the Big 5. There are 5 basic things that people need to be good at to get up here to reading comprehension, but it starts right at the bottom there with phonological awareness, and that's the ability to perceive sounds in words. And so many of of dyslexic children struggle with that. That's the starting point. They also need phonic knowledge. They need to be coached in being fluent. Vocabulary is very, very important for dyslexics and everybody else. And then we can reach comprehension via those steps. So they don't require special education. Dyslexic or not, the path follows, that path is the same for every child. It's just that some of those paths vary in length. Some of those areas that they need to concentrate on vary in length. And a lot of the time with dyslexics, it's phonological awareness and phonic knowledge that needs to be concentrated on. That's really hard for them to acquire. Accommodations are really, really helpful. So special education is one thing, but accommodation is really helpful in the classroom. And we're going to look at some accommodations now. In summary, and you will get this chart at the end of the webinar, you'll have these slides as a PDF. I'll upload them to my website. Hopefully today. I haven't uploaded yesterday's yet. I just spent the day with the family instead, but I'll get round to it today probably. I'll put these slides up on my website under resources. I'll show you where that is. But that's a chart basically showing you what dyslexia is and what it isn't. So that's dyslexia. Now, we are here for dyslexia and dysgraphia. So let's have a look. Reading is one thing, and I do a lot of presentations on reading and writing. So those of you who know me well, you've heard this before, but I keep stressing it. I keep reiterating this. It's so important. Reading is one thing, and every kid that comes to see us at Lifelong Literacy ends up reading. That's basically the expectation that we have. Writing, much, much harder. It takes a lot more time to learn, and it requires excellent input early. This example spelling test is run, top, read, book, see, play, lay, led, add, alike, mine, with, easy, shut, and done. This was a boy who was in year 4 at the time, which means he had 5 years of education by the time he came to see me. And this was still his spelling test. So his initial instruction was inadequate. So we did the whole history. It was really inadequate, but he still wasn't making it in quite a major way, still reversing after 5 years of instruction, that sort of thing. It requires excellent input early. So when I see someone who has this profile and hasn't had good input early, it's always a bit scary. Writing can be affected by dyslexia, and it can be affected by dysgraphia. So when I see a profile like this, my immediate suspicion is dysgraphia. I'll show you a little bit more about dysgraphia. With writing, there are lots of things that could possibly go wrong. There are 2 critical aspects of writing that contain the mechanics, such as posture and grip and motor control, and sometimes all of those can be impaired neurologically. This is when we start to suspect dysgraphia. So with a dyslexic child, they might have really good posture, great control of their pencil, using a comfortable grip, that sort of thing. But dysgraphic children tend to fall down in those areas as well without very, very specific early instruction. Conventions of writing also for dysgraphic children can be really difficult. Letter formation can be so hard. Punctuation, even capitals at the beginning of sentences for dysgraphic children can be so difficult to remember. full stops at the end of sentences, all of those things that you just sort of imagine children would acquire via osmosis, doesn't happen for dysgraphic children. Spelling, that's a nightmare for dyslexics and dysgraphics. And that's the transcription side of writing. There's another side of writing, and that's the content, known as text generation or ideation, including organizing your thoughts so that they can go on paper, including using the correct vocabulary, the appropriate vocabulary at the time, and being able to edit your work as well. So even if you do get some writing onto the paper, to go back and then be able to fix it up is really difficult for dysgraphics, really difficult for people who are dysgraphic. Whereas with dyslexic children, the mechanics and the conventions, the mechanics and the content sometimes is not a problem. It's usually within the conventions. So dysgraphia is two things. It's difficulty with transcription, so that's just the motor side, putting your capitals there and so on, and it's difficulty with text generation. It's those two things together that give us, or that give practitioners the ability, they measure all of those different areas and they give practitioners the ability to make a diagnosis of dysgraphia. So it's those two things, whereas dyslexia, not necessarily difficulty with the motor side, the mechanic side of transcription. It can be called disorder of written expression as well. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual will give more information about what's within those disorders. On to adjustments. Thank you for that question, Belinda. I will return to that. Reasonable adjustments for reading. So if children are having difficulty reading, if they're catching up on their reading, if they're behind in their reading, only ask them to read aloud if they're comfortable with that. So as a parent, if you're advocating for your child and you want reasonable adjustments, these are things that schools should be able to agree to. And this is what we advocate for. Only never require them to read aloud if that's not what they want to do. Allow the use of audiobooks. So that's reading too. And it does give children who are still catching up with their reading, it gives them access to all of the vocabulary and background knowledge that typically developing children get just by the simple act of independent reading. It's really important to allow audiobooks, and we have plenty of sources of audiobooks out there. Allow the use of assistive technology where appropriate as well. It's reasonable to have a child who is dyslexic or dysgraphic use speech-to-text software if the work that they're doing is not specifically to develop reading. So in maths, for instance, in mathematics, children should be allowed to have someone read the word problems to them, because mathematics is about exercising your number ability, not your decoding ability. So we get a lot of children who are dyslexic who fall behind in maths because of the wordy problems that they have to tackle. A reasonable adjustment is to make sure that we minimize those word problems, or allow them to have things like C pens where they can have an electronic reader read the problems to them. Limiting the amount of reading that is required for homework is also a good idea while people are still catching up. That's a reasonable adjustment. Reasonable adjustments for comprehension are important as well. We should always allow, if you are a teacher and if you're a parent advocating for your child, sometimes reading comprehension and listening comprehension are mixed up. And if a teacher is trying to assess how much subject matter a child is comprehending, allowing verbal comprehension assessment rather than written comprehension assessment is a reasonable adjustment. Also, providing things like, and asking your school to provide things like outlines and summaries, vocabulary words and preview questions is reasonable. It's leveling the playing field rather than making it difficult for dyslexic and dysgraphic children. And again, reducing the amount that has to be read for the curriculum. That's a reasonable adjustment. It's a reasonable adjustment. For spelling, Allowing the use of assistive technology is a reasonable adjustment. So we have spell checkers, we might as well use them. Again, with dyslexic and dysgraphic children, spelling is the nightmare. That is the thing. Fluent spelling, it's the first thing to crash under pressure as well. So allowing the use of assistive technology is reasonable. Also, though, we have to get schools to commit to teaching the rules and the structure of the English language. It's really important to have teachers good at this, because that's the basis of print. You know, and the children that are dyslexic and dysgraphic, that's what they struggle with. So we're always advocating for better teacher training. If you suspect that the teachers that are working with your children are not particularly adept at understanding the rules and structure of English, then you need to get a tutor who is adept at that. That's the bottom line. Also, it's reasonable to ask teachers to help to compile keyword lists across subjects, so that students have, because writing is really important, so students have a list of words that they don't have to pull from their long-term memory, so that they can then demonstrate their understanding in writing better. Keyword lists are reasonable. Allowing the use of assistive technology is great. Also, allowing extra time to complete writing tasks is great, and adjusting expectations of volume. I've got what I'm showing you here is an example of a structure for an instructional text. There are lots of really good resources out there for making writing easier for dyslexic and dysgraphic students, and this is one of them. Also, avoiding copying from the board is a reasonable adjustment too. And again, giving opportunities to express verbally is really, really important. This is one example of a writing frame, of a scaffold. Again, sometimes we get this leap, this gap that goes, here are some words that we've learned, and here's a writing task, and I want you to leap from here to there with no structure in between. It's reasonable to ask for much more structured material if children are being required to hand in written work. And that's across the curriculum at all levels of school, primary and secondary. The other thing that you need to know with dyslexia and dysgraphia is that you're not alone. There are lots of groups out there. Some good, some bad, and the International Dyslexia Association, again, will help you sort the wheat from the chaff there, but you're not alone. You can seek help from various individuals in your community, including educational psychologists, and they're the only ones who can diagnose dyslexia and dysgraphia at this time. Speech language professionals can screen. It's important to work alongside speech language professionals, and also to advocate for their use in schools. When schools have speech language professionals as part of their professional body, they tend to lean towards a more scientific approach to reading and writing. Occupational therapists are very, very helpful, especially for dysgraphia. They can screen and they can refer as well. And of course, specialist tutors can screen and refer too. In Australia, Dyslexia Support Australia is a Facebook page that is very strong and very intent on keeping the evidentiary base of everything that they recommend high. The Code Red Dyslexia Network, the Code Red Dyslexia Network in Australia is another good one to join for all you Australians here. And then the IDA, the International Dyslexia Association, really good starting point. Who can't help? Well, this is why we get into arguments a lot. And unfortunately, some of the things that I'm going to say may not float your boat. But you have to realize that I'm coming to this from the perspective of wanting to do the absolute best that I can for my students. We have a high caseload here. We see dozens and dozens of children every term, every year. And if there's something that's going to work for them, I'm all over it, because that's my bread and butter. We have to succeed here at Lifelong Literacy. So we will do whatever it takes, and we will get the training, whatever training is needed, and we're always on the lookout for great resources. And I'm going to share some really good resources with you shortly. But these are the people who can't help. And I've experienced all of this. I've looked at all of this, and I've even done training in a lot of these things. First of all, people who are selling brain training, anything to do with brain training, computer games that will train your working memory, train your processing speed, none of that works for dyslexia. None of that, or dysgraphia. None of that works. Unfortunately, there is no evidence behind the so-called brain training industry. It's called also neuroflapdoodle. That's how some people refer to it, and I agree with them. All learning is brain training. So the shortest distance between 2 points, if point A is not reading and point B is reading, the shortest distance between these 2 points is a straight line. And that straight line is teach them the code and get them to practice it. That's the shortest. So going off that by doing video games and all that sort of thing is just a wonky line. It's a wobbly line. Yeah. So brain training. Unfortunately, that's a no. And I have lots of experience in that. I learned the hard way. Colored lenses and overlay, people that are selling these things are not your friend. They're not friends of parents who are looking for solutions for dyslexic children. I don't want to get too much into that debate. We can certainly get into it more on Facebook. The reason I don't debate this too strongly is because there will be parents out there, and maybe you're one of them, who has seen, who has a personal tale about how colored lenses or overlays helped your child, and that's great. I'm glad they were helped. Unfortunately, the evidence over a large population shows that there is no improvement, very, very little improvement, if any, and those improvements, even if they do occur, are not permanent. They're placebo improvements. So unfortunately, it would be so good if we could just give them lenses and just put colored overlays over what they're reading, and I would do it if it helped, but I'm just absolutely unconvinced of it. Behavioral optometrists, those are specialist eye practitioners who come up with all kinds of diagnoses about eye problems and how that relates to literacy. Literacy acquisition is a brain thing. It has a phonological component. The eyes maybe are the first line of sort of defense in learning to read and write, but it's reading and writing is not a visual memory thing. It's not a visual thing. So behavioral optometrists who say that they can help with literacy, I'm afraid are not, they're not speaking the truth. And the large peak bodies for optometry, like the American Association of Ophthalmologists, I think it's called, the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Optometrists, have all distanced themselves from behavioral optometrists. They're not real scientists. Same with listening therapy merchants. You might as well work on your knees or your elbows. If you're working on the ear, that organ there, for reading and writing, you're barking up the wrong tree. Kinesiologists, I'm sure they're lovely people. Same with chiropractors. I'm sure they're amazing human beings, but they don't help with reading and writing. It's a code, and it's a code that needs to be practiced, needs to be explicitly taught in a good sequence and practiced. Same with reading recovery teachers. Unfortunately, reading recovery is a program that is based on the idea that if you just get a child immersed in reading, and if you teach them strategies that have got nothing to do with looking at words, but to do with pictures and to do with guessing, then they're going to learn to read. Unfortunately, they will not help dyslexic children. Dietitians as well, it's got nothing to do with the gut. And anyone who tells you their anecdote about being cured by something that wasn't systematic, structured language lessons are probably, there's no evidence behind what they're saying. As parents, demand and supply is important. You can demand high quality instruction at the primary level, and it's really important to do this. This means that you don't accept snake oil. So even in this day and age, I have students who come to me who say, my child's teacher recommended behavioral optometry. Don't accept that. It's not, that is passing of the buck. If a child's teacher has failed to teach, or if the school has failed to teach the child to read, they shouldn't be referring on to snake oil merchants. Non-acceptance of low or no evidence instructional methods. If you are a parent and you're interested in advocating for a better deal for all children, then you need to, again, look at what the research is telling us about how children acquire literacy best, and it's not through guessing. Actively participating and devising effective individual learning plans is really, really important in schools, guiding teachers as to how and to measurable goals and how they'll be achieved in reading is really important. And committing to providing assistance in the interim. Unfortunately, a lot of school districts and schools are ill-equipped to have children become literate because of the training that those teachers have had and because of the philosophy behind whole language, balanced literacy and guessing. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to take matters into our own hands, and I'll show you some resources that will help with that. Also, parents need to understand accommodations and assistive technology, and I'm not an expert on that, but there are lots of experts that can help with the latest in assistive technology. Here's some recommended reading. The first one is the Bible. Sorry for any religious people out there. No, it's not the Bible, but it is a very important resource to have if you are on a dyslexia, dysgraphia, or any other developmental disorder journey. This is a good investment to make. Pamela Snow and Caroline Bowen have two practitioners, two psychologists and speech pathologists have written this book and it goes over basically lots of different interventions and things that are recommended when parents are on this journey of my child has a developmental disorder, what do I do? And they give it yay or nay. It's an absolutely essential part of any parent's arsenal. I'm going to skip this slide. It's about spelling. The only thing that I do say is we shouldn't accept the myth of randomness. English is complex, but it's not random. I also do things like proposing an alternative to look, say, cover, write, check. That's what that means. If you're teaching a child to spell, writing rows and rows of the same word is just saturation. You'll just saturate their ability to think. Instead, we need to group words in families, and I've done a webinar about that called the survival list. We need to mark the tricky parts, and we need to read first for spelling, then for reading one word at a time. And I've got videos on that you can access to. I also see a lot of guides to reading for parents that say guess, that say teach your child to guess and they'll be okay when you're reading with them. So I've come up with the decoding dragon, which helps keep the guessing monster away, and it helps you spell. So for dyslexic and dysgraphic students, this is a good one. Go through the whole word from start to finish. Even if you mispronounce the word, you've begun to map the word. That is, you've begun to efficiently place it in long-term memory for instant recall and recognition later. Even if the word is not there in your lexicon yet, you've begun to map the word if you go through the whole word. It's a really important thing to tell your child rather than guessing. So when you see resources like this, Skippy frog, chunky monkey, stretchy snake is okay, but lips the fish, eagle eye, look at the picture, all of these things, these are not good for dyslexic and dysgraphic or dysgraphic children, because you need to sequence that word and map it to put it into your long-term memory for spelling. Some resources before we answer some questions, because I can see we're about to go over time and I don't want to keep you too long. This for homeschooling parents, and we're all homeschooling parents now at the moment. If you have a beginner in your midst, somebody who hasn't really got the code yet, this is the book. Grab that from Book Depository. This is the book that will help them to read and write. I can't recommend it more strongly. I taught my children to read using this one. It has phonological awareness exercises in it. It has writing components and it has no guessing. An absolutely fabulous resource. The other one is Toe by Toe. We're homeschooling parents, so that means that we're not particularly experts in helping children to learn to read and write, but Toe by Toe doesn't require a great deal of expertise, and it's systematic. It's not particularly diagnostic, but it's systematic and sequential, and there are tons of exercises where reading and writing and phonics is broken down into easily manageable parts. This is a good one if your kids have got some basic code already. And then there is reading pathways. If your children have got some basic, SAT, PIN, SAT, PIN, if they can sound words out that contain those phonemes and graphemes, reading pathways is a great resource as well. I'm going to do an entire PD. I'm going to do an entire webinar on reading pathways. So I would, if you are a parent and you're starting to work with your dyslexic or dysgraphic kid, or one that you suspect, this is the resource. Grab this, because there will be a webinar on that really, really soon. Nope. All right. Yes, Alyssa.
Hi, Lyn. I've got a question relating to a child who, when asked a word, to spell a word, for example, can spell no problem, but when writing drops out sound, like drops out letters. So if they're just focusing on one thing at a time, there's no problem. Would that, and that's sort of a grade 2 child, would that indicate that really like to have that investigated?
Certainly. Look, if anything, I mean, I can't answer individual case questions, obviously, because I don't have that history. But I'm sorry, I'm muting a few mics again because there's a lot of squeaking in the background. It's hard for me to give you information on that particular child. However, the blanket answer to that question is, if they're not keeping up, you've got to ask yourself why. And that's where referral to a professional would be helpful. It's never in your imagination.
No, it's not so much about keeping up. It's just a persistence. And we do have dyslexia in the family. She's actually quite ahead, but has had MSL from a very young age. So, there aren't any red flags sort of academically. It's more that because of our family history, I'm sort of sitting on the fence in terms of whether to look into that. But that's something that I'm seeing. So in isolation, you ask her how to spell the word stop, and it's no problem, and it's automatic. But in writing, she'll write it 4 times, and 2 of those times there'll be letters missing.
Yeah, so there could be a whole host of things, which are, again, from
sure,
it can be working memory, processing speed, all of those things. That's why cognitive assessment's really, I think, a good idea if there's a suboptimum thing going on. That's the best that I can say. In the meantime, of course, there's lots of things that you can do. There are lots of good resources, since you're probably going to be stuck indoors with your children for a while. The other good resource that I recommend a lot is Equipped for Reading Success by David. You've got that? So doing the 1-minute exercises from there is a fabulous idea too.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next person, if you want to put your hand up, because Alyssa did a brilliant job there. She put her hand up and then unmuted her mic, and so I knew exactly who it was, and it worked really well. Alyssa, you're a star. I'm going to lower your mic and mute you again, so lower your hand and mute you again. So anyone else who wants to ask a question, you might want to do that and go ahead and ask. But just looking at the chat for a second, Belinda, you asked, is it genetic? There is a family history indicator. There's no genetic marker. Nobody's sequenced anything like dyslexia in any human genome. But what we do find, and there's a prevalence, if somebody has dyslexia, there will be somebody in the immediate family, even out towards aunts and uncles, who also have that. So there's a feeling, there's a thought that it might be genetic. And yes, I'm not emailing out any links because there are too many participants. So what I'm going to do is show you my website now, and this is where you can get all of the information that you want. So I'm about to share my screen again. Just put that up there. So my website is lifelongliteracy.com, and that's what it looks like. If you go to this tab here, resources, what you've got underneath there is a section called free webinars. If you click on that, you'll find the recording and the handout and the slides. If there are handouts, there's always a recording and slides of all of the webinars. When they're blue like this, you can download them. So I haven't uploaded yesterday's webinar yet. And at some point today, I'll upload today's as well. That's how you can find them. I can't email individuals, unfortunately. We've got hundreds of people from around the world. I hope that answers your question, Belinda. Belinda also asked, do these individuals have midline issues and upper lower body stuff? With midline, I'm a little bit skeptical. So it's not something I assess. My assessments contain, can they read and write? And if they can't, at expectancy, then that gives me information about what I do next. As far as midline goes, I know that there are some occupational therapists that talk about it. I'm not particularly convinced. I think everybody should have a strong core, yeah, my jury's out on midline stuff. Is there a more recent edition of Teach Your Child to Read? Yes, there is, Monica. The slide that I showed you was the most recent one. So if you go on to Book Depository, you'll get the most recent one. Yes, there's one further on than the 1986 edition. Michelle, you mentioned the importance of systematic introduction of phonics. Do you follow a particular order? Do I? No, because the children that come to me are already preloaded. So that's why I have to be trained in lots of different programs, because they've already had a sequence. They've already had some system or other, or a very, very loose system. So I don't follow a particular order. I very rarely teach initial reading. I very rarely teach that. That's not my job. However, if I were to do it, I would follow what's called the Carnine sequence. Doug Carnine came up with a sequence of introduction of, no, wait a minute, privately, everyone, there we go. I'll just write the Carnine sequence again. If you Google the Carnine sequence, you'll come up with what Doug Carnine proposed, and I think it's a really, really good idea. It basically proposes a sequence that is easy for children to understand and learn and use quickly. So within that sequence is sounds that you can, continuance, sounds that you can stretch out, like first, and not introducing letters that are similar, like B and D. You're going to put some space in between B and D. Those are some of the basics of the Carnine sequence. Thank you, Michelle. The Decoding Dragon definitely has been quite popular. Thank you, everyone. Once again, everyone's being very kind and saying thank you. I thank you. It's a great outlet for me to be able to do this, and you're very, very kind for coming. Yes, the Jammies lessons will be recorded indeed, so you don't have to wait up if you're over on the other side of the world. We'll form a series of those. Goodness knows how they're going to go, because it's going to be me in my pajamas and children, but you know, you might as well have a baptism by fire. So yes, they'll be recorded, and hopefully bump into you online sometime in the future. Take care, everyone. I'm ending the meeting now. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.